Hello and welcome to Conflict on Camera. This is Paul Woodadge for WW2TV, and we are talking about a fairly famous photo taken in Cherbourg in June 1944. And joining me to talk about it is a German historian, and I do like to get people from other countries involved in these shows, Alexander Braun. He did the D-Day, Germans on D-Day show with me back in June last year, and he's joining me to talk about this photo, which he selected. So welcome to the show, Alexander.
Well, thank you, Paul. Good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Good. And for those watching, Alexander and Sean Claxton, another World War II TV regular, have commenced a new project, virtual tours of Normandy. You can find the links in the description below, which is a very exciting way of bringing Normandy to your living room via the medium of the internet and Zoom and Google Earth and all those wonderful things. So we are talking about this photo here. People have seen this photo before, I'm sure, but when was it taken, where was it taken, and what does it depict?
All right, folks. So what we see in this rather famous photograph is the surrender of German Lieutenant General Karl-Wilhelm von Schlieben, who was the commander of the Cherbourg fortress. Von Schlieben is the tall soldier in the center of this photo wearing his steel helmet, slightly hidden by an American GI in the foreground. To the right of von Schlieben is Konteradmiral or Rear Admiral Walter Hennicke, who is the commander of the Normandy seafront. And this rather famous and probably very first surrender during the Normandy campaign took place in front of an underground bunker on June 26, 1944, around mid-afternoon in a little suburb of Cherbourg in Octeville.
And Cherbourg was an early objective of the Allies, 7th Corps from Utah Beach. It took us a lot longer to get there than we anticipated. And I don't think enough people, when they visit Normandy, focus on Cherbourg, which, is to their shame because it is an important objective. You've got the 4th Division, 9th Division, 79th Division, all those American units heading that way. So my question to you is, what about that photo to you makes it interesting, particularly because you're German yourself? What's its selling point?
Well, I guess the selling point is it's the first big surrender of a German commanding officer in the Normandy campaign. It is in Cherbourg, and the essence and importance of Cherbourg is not the city itself, it's the port. And the port was probably the key target of the American landings because the port had some huge importance for bringing on ashore supplies, reinforcements, petrol, everything else. Everything you would need in order to, feed your lodgement area with supplies.
And probably Cherbourg has been rather overshadowed in recent years by the Mulberry harbours and the fact that that's, in the end, how we brought a lot of supplies ashore. But let's go back to the photo. How did the surrender come about? This incident, did it happen quickly in the end? Was it days and days of build-up? What was the thought process between the Germans there? Run us through those last few hours or days as the Allies were pressing on the city from various directions. And just to add a bit of the geography, for those who've been up there, the Cherbourg area is very hilly. It's not mountainous, but there's big hills there. There's the major hill in Cherbourg. You've got some hedgerows around the town as well. It's quite tough terrain, but run us through the last few hours or days of the German garrison.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the surrender took place on the 26th, so that's 20 days after D-Day. And initially, the Allied plan was that Cherbourg should be captured by June 12th, so just 6 days after D-Day. And the Germans, by chance, got hold of the operations plans of the US 7th Corps, so the corps that landed on the Cotentin Peninsula. And there they could read that the plan was to capture Cherbourg by June 12th. And that, in turn, then probably made some of the German high commanders pretty nervous, as you can imagine. And that is why Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the CNC of the German army in the West, instructed Konteradmiral Hennicke to start with the destruction of the Cherbourg harbor already by June 10th. So just 4 or 5 days after the landings took place, the Germans prepared the demolition of the harbor.
The German garrison there, the problem with it being on a peninsula like that is there is nowhere to retreat to once everything closes in around you. In other areas of Normandy, even the Falaise pocket, which we've talked about in other shows, some Germans were able to escape, get out to fight again. But in Cherbourg, there's nowhere to go. So how did the German garrison in Cherbourg deal with that situation of an impending calamity? Because they know that no matter how good a job they're going to do, this overwhelming steamroller of Allied munitions and armor is going to come their way. So what was their plan to defend the city?
Well, initially, obviously, the Germans were hoping that they could contain the bridgehead or the beachhead around Carentos and Méeglise in this area. And then only on June the 14th, when the Americans started to break out of this bridgehead towards the west coast of the Cotentin, the Germans really started preparations in terms of defending the harbor. So they built or set up two battle groups. One was commanded by Lieutenant General Helmich, and this battle group was supposed to prevent the Americans to break out to the west and therefore splitting the peninsula into half and therefore cutting off German garrison to the north. The other battle group was commanded by von Schlieben himself, and his mission was to prevent the Americans to get to Cherbourg harbor. So that was the starting point. And then the Germans pulled back towards this land front Cherbourg, which was a defensive, well-prepared perimeter, 60 kilometers long with about 90 resistance nests, but mostly field fortifications, so not a lot of concrete bunkers, but still prepared. And the Germans fell back to this land front Cherbourg and occupied that land front. Von Schlieben realized very early in the process that he was in a very dire situation. He had 21,000 men available, but of these 21,000 men, probably only 2,000 to 3,000 were experienced combat soldiers. All the others were just a ragtag of different units, Navy personnel, Air Force personnel, artillery gun crews that have lost their guns. So even workers from the organization TOT were part of this land front Cherbourg. But nevertheless, despite all the despair that was spreading among the leadership, the generals and commanding officers, the objective was quite clear. They needed to buy time so that harbor installations could be destroyed fully. And that was one of the directions Hitler had issued directly to von Schlieben. He made him commander of what he called Cherbourg Fortress on June the 23rd, I believe it was. And he was basically instructed to fight to the last cartridge. And the ultimate goal was don't leave the Allies once they capture the Cherbourg a usable port. That was the ultimate objective. And there was another objective. The second one was if and when the Cherbourg garrison could buy time, not only to complete the destruction of the harbor, but also to allow Rommel and the German forces in the south on the base of the Cotentin Peninsula to build a new defensive line, which later was called the Malmön Line. So to bring in reinforcements, mainly from the Brittany Peninsula, so that even if the Allies would capture Cherbourg and then would turn south to really break out into Brittany, that the Germans had enough time available to build this second defensive line on the base of the peninsula.
And that's a very good point, Alexander, because I think all of us, when we see a photo, and I've entitled this show Surrender, our senses of defeat, of despair, of having failed. But actually, what you're saying is, to the extent of their orders, they've actually succeeded. They've mostly destroyed the harbour. They've delayed the Allies for a good couple of extra weeks. And, of course, we now have to know the army has to get back down again from Cherbourg. So you get that delay, don't you, kind of in the Saint-Lô, Perrier area, Carenton, because it takes a while for the 7th Corps to come back down again. So in a sense, we could say when we're looking at that photo that those German commanders, they think, well, hey, we've done our job. We've achieved what we've been ordered to do. So this isn't a defeat per se, because we're allowing something to happen elsewhere. And I like that idea of a single photo not necessarily being taken on its own. You have to take it in context of a greater plan. And also, I want to ask you more about the German defense in Cherbourg itself, because to me, I feel it has a sense of that Singapore aspect in that most of the defenses there are defending the port out to sea, the big naval batteries up near Octeville and east and west of the harbour. And the line you're talking about, they kind of hastily constructed. When you're driving to Cherbourg now, a lot of that, because I've had a look on my map to try and find some of these field positions, it's under where the roundabouts and the industrial estates and the supermarkets are these days. So you can't really see some of that line of defenses. So you talk about the 21,000 men in Cherbourg, but let's run through some of the armaments and the batteries they had there to defend that region, because it's considerable, isn't it?
Yes, it was. I mean, the main strong point in Cherbourg itself, Cherbourg proper, was the Fort du Roule. That was a large fortress perched on a hill, I think 60 or 70 meters high, at least, if not higher. But as you rightly pointed out, the guns that were installed in tunnels in this fort, they were basically directed at the port. So they were supposed to defend the port against a naval attack. There was not that much directed towards the south. As I said, there was this rather makeshift land front Cherbourg, mainly field fortifications. And there was some artillery, yes, but the Germans, because they didn't get any supply. Once the peninsula was cut on June 18th, there was no supply and no reinforcements coming from the south. So once the Germans had more or less used up their ammunition, they were more or less helpless. There was another opportunity for the Germans. They had quite some anti-aircraft guns there, so 88 millimeter flak. But the problem was they were also in a position to more or less defend the harbor and the city itself towards aerial raids. The problem was they couldn't move the flak guns into positions that made them suitable for ground combat, because the tractors that were used to move these guns, they were parked in the drop zones. The 82nd Airborne dropped on D-Day, and therefore all these tractors were lost. So the Germans had a lot of guns, and especially flak guns, but they couldn't use them because they were in positions that were not suitable for ground combat. What's interesting here is that it shows the surrender scene from a different perspective. The camera angle is a different one, and it clearly shows two tunnel entrances. Because before von Schlieben and all in all, more than 840 Germans, of which 300 were seriously wounded, surrendered. They were hiding for a couple of days in an underground complex. And this was 4 parallel tunnels, the longest of which was 105 meters long, and the other 3 were just 85 meters long. And these tunnels formed the underground command center of the German Navy. And when von Schlieben and his men had to retreat from the land from Cherbourg, they basically took shelter in this underground complex. And what's interesting about this particular underground complex is that works had begun in autumn 1943 already, so quite some time before the landings. And it required thorough geological studies. And the work was then carried out by about 1,000 Russian and Ukrainian prisoners of war, who basically worked day and night to complete these tunnels. And it was virtually a slave's life for these poor men. Many of them did not survive the harsh conditions and the treatment, and therefore are still buried today in some of the cemeteries of Cherbourg. This souterrain network was to provide quarters for the Kriegsmarine units, also to store equipment, and it served, as I said, as a command post. Contrary to legend, it seems that there was no or never a hospital. So what you see here is the Villa Meurice. And the Villa Meurice itself was another building where the German Kriegsmarine headquarters was based. Because of its grandeur and impressive looks, it was also used for receptions, of official dinners and things like that. And it also was home to the German Naval Intelligence Center in Normandy. What is interesting about this Villa Meurice is not so much that it was another building the German Navy was billeted in. What's interesting really is that this particular building was captured by a British commando unit. I'm not sure that everybody really knows that some British commando units were involved in the capture of Cherbourg. And this particular unit was a detachment of the 30th Assault Unit, which landed at Utah Beach on June 10th. And they were tasked with examining suspected German V-1 missile sites on the peninsula. And they also took part in the capture of Cherbourg. They launched an assault on Octeville, and they were the ones who captured the Villa Meurice.
Going back to the actual main photo itself, anything else in that photo that is really interesting, Alexander?
Well, I think the most important facts I already mentioned. What's maybe worth mentioning is an interpretation of the American GI who is basically raising his right arm, not certainly to salute the two German generals with the German goose. That's probably not what he had intended. It's probably waving out some of the prisoners from these tunnels, or probably most likely that they should raise their hands. I think that is more or less what this picture and this image displays and gets across. But there is one other important aspect of this surrender, which is not really visible in this image. And it's the fact that when von Schlieben surrendered, he only surrendered this force of 840 men that were with him in this underground tunnel. When he met Major General Menton Eddy, who was the commander of the US 9th Division, the unit basically that captured him, Eddy demanded von Schlieben to surrender the entire Cherbourg garrison. And Schlieben refused to do that, and he was arguing that his communications network had broken down, and that even if he wanted to, he could not issue a surrender order to his troops who were still fighting. And when Major General Collins then later on offered von Schlieben to provide him with the necessary technical equipment, the German general nevertheless refused to issue the general surrender. And that meant that the fighting in Cherbourg continued till the June 29th, when Kapitänleutnant or Fregattenkapitän, I think he was, Hermann Witt, surrendered as the last German defender of Cherbourg harbor on one of these castles or fortresses that were positioned on the outer mole, the outer kind of harbor area.
And that's interesting because that suggests, again, that reinforces the idea that this surrender, the Germans feel they've done their job. This isn't despair. This isn't capitulation. This is all part of their plan. The fact he's not surrendering the entire garrison is I'm not saying it's arrogant, but it's demonstrating that he thinks he's in control of the situation. Whereas generally when you think of a surrender, you think of, that's it, we're throwing in the towel, it's all over, you do exactly what your captor tells you. But in this case, the fact he's not surrendering the garrison suggests to me that he's thinking of this bigger game. He's thinking of this time he's buying for the Germans elsewhere, which is fascinating because it means that there's more going on in that photo than you see on first glance.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Paul. I mean, basically, two words, mission accomplished. As tragic as it was for the Germans who were trapped in this port, and more so for those who were killed, mission accomplished. And the fact that the mission was accomplished is really evident in the fact that only 3 weeks after the Americans captured the port, they could start to basically unload the first small coasters, not large transport ships, because the harbor was really destroyed. There were minefields. The Germans sunk several ships and coasters. The harbor was basically unusable. And there's a great statement, if you will, by the American officer who was charged with the task of restoring and repairing the harbor. And this chap reported, I quote, "The demolition of the port is a masterful job, beyond the doubt, the most complete, intensive, and best planned demolition in history." And I think that statement really says it all.
Absolutely, because, my sister-in-law lives in Cherbourg. Mag's sister has a hotel there. And Cherbourg, because it was the first major town liberated, I guess. I mean, you could count Bayeux and Courcelles, but, there's all that footage, isn't there? The Americans going up, marching up and down through the harbor, and Germans coming out and flags and what have you. And there's numerous of the French published little magazines and books I've got. And it's all about capitulation, liberation, victory, the vanquished Germans. And what you're essentially saying is, this is more like a Dunkirk in sense for the Germans, in that they have bought time. They're coming out with their heads held high, having done what they're supposed to have done. No, they haven't saved their own men, but they have indirectly helped other Germans gain more time to, in their opinion, keep the Normandy campaign going. And that's not what we normally see when we look at that photo. Even myself, I look at that photo and I see surrender. And what point you're making is job done, mission accomplished, harbor destroyed, and we're going into captivity with that pride of having done our job to the best of our abilities.
Absolutely. And, another very impressive evidence that the Germans or German high command and Hitler himself was quite pleased with what had been achieved was the fact that he awarded the Knight's Cross to Admiral Hennecke, even though he was already in captivity, because he had done such a marvelous job in destroying the harbor. And then on the other hand, Hitler was very furious at von Schlieben, and he even denounced him as a disgrace to his uniform and the lowest form of a German general. So a bit of a bizarre reaction, basically both ends of a reaction scale, if you will. But Hennecke was awarded the Knight's Cross.
And that again is very telling, because later on in the campaign, Hitler doesn't have any patience for anybody who, in his opinion, lets the Third Reich down. It's just instant, dismissal or punishment or whatever. So this is a very interesting chapter, because, we have to also look back at this time, late June. There is a possibility the Germans could not necessarily stop the Allies, but at least cause enough problems for there to be some kind of negotiated peace. The war's not completely lost yet. A few weeks later on, kind of the war is lost, but there's still a fighting chance in late June the Germans could, switch the tables a bit. But anyway, this has been a fascinating conversation, Alexander, and I hope you'll come back and do another photo later. And I particularly like the fact that, we're having a German coming on talking about something, because it's too often it's British and American people talking about Normandy, and the German side is incredibly important and incredibly nuanced, and understanding the background of this photo has been very, very rewarding. So thank you very much, Alexander. And again, folks, don't forget, if you've got a photo you'd like to talk about on World War II TV, get in touch with me. You can come on, you can talk about it. Again, check the links below to Alexander and Sean's virtual touring project. And thank you for watching. This has been Paul Woodadge and Alexander Brown for World War II TV. Enjoy the rest of your day.